it's a even it's a really, demanding, frightening subject that we're dealing with. And just to say, it's a special pleasure to be doing this with Tom, who I've had the pleasure of working with over the last number of years, and glad to be working with Peace News again after many years. I thought before jumping into the history, which I'll just summarize in the book, I thought to begin with the situation we face at the moment, because we're not just dealing with history, we're dealing with the current moment. To my surprise, I was invited to participate in a track two confidential diplomatic session. I'm sort of the one that's not like all the others. These are mostly men who, from Russia, from Europe, from the United States, who have negotiated arms control with one another, who have been advisors or are advisors to their governments, and who have been senior military officials. It's been interesting to say the least. We began. I joined it not long before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Simply to say that what one hears in those discussions is that the situation is bleak. This is independent of what's happening in Gaza, and to a significant degree, it goes way beyond Ukraine, as the Ukraine war is really a war over what the future security architecture or insecurity architecture in Europe will be, and even beyond in terms of the global disorder. Um, what we hear there is that there'll be no resumption of arms control diplomacy until there's an end to the Ukraine war. There's linkage here. And this means, among other things, that there's no negotiations going on to do the tweaks or significant revisions that are needed in the New START treaty, which expires early in 2026. And it means that we have the other disarmament treaties either suspended or done. INF, conventional forces in Europe, open skies, and so on. And we face a situation where perhaps even before New START expires, we face the possibility of an unrestrained nuclear arms race, which has been described to this as analogous to the situation in the 1950s at the opening of the Cold War. We have, as you can read in your press and maybe Peace News, we've got U.S. nuclear weapons coming back to Britain at Lakenheath, and we have in the last week or so growing concerns about the possibility that Russia may put nuclear anti-satellite weapons in space, which would, if they function, would have the capability to pretty much blind U.S. forces that are dependent on satellite communications. Yeah, just to say that here, I don't know how much it's focused on in Britain, but we have the reality of China's rise, and China basically is moving toward parity. The estimate is that they're up to 500 nuclear weapons and may aim in stages to go up to equal what the United States and Russia have. And we have very serious confrontations, even as there's a functioning détente at the moment over Taiwan in the South China Sea, especially, and maybe to a lesser extent, but really quite real, the Japanese-Chinese confrontation over the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands in the East China Sea. So it's a particularly nasty time. The Chinese, unlike the U.S. and Russia, have a no first use policy, and they've been urging the United States to match that, and that could provide a foundation for disarmament or arms control negotiations. Okay, let me then turn to the book. Britain with your imperial history is maybe a little bit more proud or identifies more with your empire, with your imperial history. Here in the United States, because the country was founded in an anti-colonial revolution, anti-imperialist revolution against Britain, to talk about empire has been verboten. During the Cold War period, maybe we want to say the first Cold War period, to use language like imperialism or empire was to be identified as someone aligned with the Soviet Union, Marxist-Leninist. And that really made it difficult to teach history and to know really where we are. I have a peculiar history. When I went to college, I wanted to be both a freedom rider in the civil rights movement and a U.S. diplomat. And I learned that with Vietnam, I couldn't be that diplomat. But I had a really excellent professor of U.S. diplomatic history. And when we got to the 1890s, and if you look at least the textbooks that I grew up with in high school, they describe the period from 1898 to 1900 as the imperial era. It only lasted 2 years, so-called. But he described the situation in which figures like Theodore Roosevelt, Secretary of the Navy, Henry Cabot Lodge, a leader in the U.S. Senate, and certainly Admiral Mahan, who is the theorist of naval power, all thought that the United States should be able to compete with Britain and other colonial powers, but it required having a navy that could compete with Britain's. So that navy was built over the course of the 1890s. And then, as he explained, the 1890s were also marked by a really disastrous economic depression. And you had the big money, the oligarchs of the time, had the analysis that if we could win at least a good portion of the China market, which they described as the holy grail of capitalism, we could have U.S. Factories working 24/7, and we'd have labor peace because workers would not be afraid of being unemployed, and they would have better wages because so much production. And so growing out of that, you had the so-called Spanish-American War, in which and one of the other things he did was to show us on a map how close Subic Bay in the Philippines was or is to the China coast. He described it as a perfect round harbor, and I've been there, seen it, and he was absolutely right. So the United States conquered Philippines, Guam, Samoa, Cuba, and Puerto Rico to control the Caribbean and at least the northern portion of South America. And that provided the foundation for empire. You go into the 1920s, and you have negotiations between the U.S., Britain, and Japan over naval forces to kind of maintain a balance. And then you had the Japanese portions of its elite decided to go for the whole melon. They didn't want to be under U.S. and Russian, U.S. and British control. They, launched became a 15-year war, and disaster across Asia for Japan. And at the end of the war, the United States emerged as the dominant colonial power in Asia Pacific. The Pacific referred to as an American lake, and especially in the Middle East, but Europe as a whole as well, with the decline of the European empires, the United States, largely inherited what they had. And that's been enforced by U.S. nuclear threats since, actually, in part created by U.S. nuclear threats beginning in 1945. And then we had the really beginning with the with 9/11 and the war that followed that, which Bush just described as a war to impose a new world order, what we say goes. And that also had its nuclear foundations, which I'll explain. And now we're in a situation where, with China's rise especially, but also some of the rise of the rest, as the U.S. national security statement says, the post-Cold War era is over. The period of unilateralism is over. And the struggle, the competition is on to shape what comes next. And that's the world we're in. It's that contest for what the new order is going to be. So then let me move into the nuclear threats, and to begin by saying that Putin and Medvedev especially have been drawing from the U.S. playbook from the beginning of the Ukraine war. With their nuclear threats, they've basically, as Noam Chomsky put it, otherwise, they're moving to ensure that those who might come to protect those that they're determined to attack are at least limited in what they can do. So we have these repeated nuclear threats. Some of them we have to take seriously, and that's really what the United States has done now over a period of about 75 years. I got my first insight into this in 1973. I was in Copenhagen visiting with friends, actually, from the International Fellowship of Reconciliation. We thought that the October War in the Middle East was over. There was a ceasefire been declared. And I woke in the morning and they were listening to Armed Forces radio, and it stated that U.S. nuclear forces were on alert. My first thought was to wonder if Nixon was trying to pull a coup d'etat in the last stages of the Watergate crisis. But calling my friends, I was sure that that was not the case. In fact, the Secretary of Defense at the time had made an order that no significant troop movements were to be made without his authorization, because he did fear that Nixon might actually try a coup. Um, uh, and over time, what I learned, as documented in the book, um, Kissinger had basically given the green light to Golda Meir to disregard the ceasefire. And Israeli forces kept moving deeper into the Sinai toward Cairo. And worse, the Egyptian Third Army, which was already defeated, was essentially surrounded and being denied food and water. So Sadat faced, if you will, a double crisis, not only having lost the war, but the destruction of what remained of his army. And so on a given night, Sadat sent a message saying that in the morning he would go to the UN asking for U.S. and Soviet intervention to enforce the ceasefire. Well, Kissinger had been doing his best to manage the outcome of the war in a way that would really consolidate U.S. unilateral control in the Middle East. The last thing he wanted was for the Soviets to come in and have a share of what would follow from the war. So he immediately did two things. He put U.S. forces on a nuclear alert to signal the Russians to stay out, and he told Golda it's time now to honor the ceasefire. And for me, that has been sort of the model that I've been working with. Um, in December of 1991, I was in the Middle East, including in Lebanon, and we were aware that the Israelis were bringing forces into southern Lebanon, basically trying to initiate a war. And the Lebanese didn't bite, but come June, just about the time that we had the largest nuclear disarmament demonstration in U.S. history here with 1 million people in New York, the war went wide open. And I was aware that behind Israeli forces would be U.S. nuclear forces. And if Syria intervened on behalf of Lebanese, we'd have the Soviets behind the Syrians. So there was a kind of a mad scramble to try to get our movement here to respond to that. Afterwards, I spent a fair bit of time with Daniel Ellsberg. Dan, as most of you know, best known for releasing the Pentagon Papers, the secret history of U.S. war planning in Vietnam from 1945 into the late 60s, for which he was sentenced to life in prison. But he had earlier been the principal author of U.S. nuclear warfighting policy and doctrine, and then he turned on it. And he helped to explain that in making the U.S. Policy, the consistent element was that we had used our nuclear weapons repeatedly since Nagasaki. That we had used it in the same way that an armed robber uses a gun when he points it at his victim's head. Whether or not the trigger is pulled, the gun has been used. And that's really the pattern that the United States has used in now during more than 30 international crises and wars. Harold Brown, who was formerly it's actually Carter's Secretary of Defense, said that our nuclear forces make our conventional weapons credible sources of power, meaning that once we either explicitly or even implicitly use our nuclear weapons like a cowboy uses his 6 guns, even if they're just at his side, in order to enforce our power. So let me just run through some of the histories. I mean, first of all, just to say, and I've written about it in the book and elsewhere, the Hiroshima and Nagasaki A bombs were not needed to end the war against Japan. And it was known at the time. Secretary of War Stimson, General Eisenhower, and others all said that we could win Japan's surrender on terms acceptable to the United States without the use of those nuclear weapons. So why were they used? There were a number of forces leading to it, including Truman's fear that if he went into the 1948 presidential election and it was learned that the U.S. had spent $2 billion to build the bomb, and it wasn't used while some U.S. troops continued to die, that he'd be vulnerable in the election. There was basic forces of racism. But what we learn is that the determinative reason was to bring the war to an immediate end. I mean, even the man who led the firebombing of 66 Japanese cities to the ground, it was clear that the Japanese would be forced to surrender by November in any event. But the idea was if they could bring the war to an immediate end before the Soviets came in, the U.S. could consolidate its control in northern China, in Manchuria, and even in Korea. So the idea was to bring it to an immediate end. The Russians declared war on August the 8th, and the 9th was the Nagasaki bomb. Ironically, you have the futility in that in the end, the U.S., out of all three, the U.S. basically gained control over southern Korea, but not more. So you had that model. You have the next use in 1948 during the Second World War. The U.S. had provided weapons and supplies to its ally, the Soviet Union, via Iran, and there were Soviet troops in Iran. The Soviet troops did not use the end of the war to immediately withdraw. And so in 48, Truman, as he wrote, called the Soviet ambassador into the White House and said that if they didn't begin the withdrawal within 48 hours, he would use nuclear weapons against the Soviets. And remember that in Truman's memoirs, he had described having the A-bomb as having a hammer over those boys, meaning the Kremlin leaders. Soviets began pulling out in 24 hours. So you have a model there. We had repeated threats. I mean, Korea has been almost the most the site of the most threats. Early on, during the Korean War, 1950, MacArthur is urging to get authorization to use U.S. nuclear weapons. The idea he had was to bomb all along the border. Maybe it was 51 that he made this particular threat, basically to create a radioactive cobalt barrier between China and Korea, which would secure almost all of Korea for the United States. Truman decided not to do that. We have a major threat in 1952-53. There had been ongoing negotiations for the release of political prisoners on both sides, not political prisoners, but prisoners of war. and they were stuck in large measure, and not entirely unlike Gaza and Israel at the moment, over proportion the number who would be released in exchange for the number that would be released. And Eisenhower, while running for president, said he had a secret plan to end the war. When he came to power, as he wrote, he let it be known that he could use nuclear weapons unless the North Koreans and the Chinese acceded to our demands, which they did. And that in turn provided the model for Richard Nixon. I'm jumping over a lot of history at the moment, but simply to say that in 1968, Nixon's campaigning for presidency, and he says he has a secret plan to end the war. None of us believe him, and he wins. And then, as we can read in Kissinger's memoirs and others, basically they, through a series of diplomatic contacts, including via France, they sent a word to the North Vietnamese that if they didn't accede to U.S. terms in negotiating an end to the war, the U.S. would either use nuclear weapons against North Vietnam or destroy its dam infrastructure and destroy the country that way. And the Vietnamese held tight on that. They didn't just go belly up. And at the same time, there were massive demonstrations against the war here in the United States. And what we learned later was that on Kissinger's staff, his staff are writing that if the U.S. used nuclear weapons, there would be demonstrations and protests here of just enormous power and influence that would seriously disrupt the government. We had, just in the run-up to it, several 100,000 people demonstrating against the war in Washington, marching past the White House. And this was unprecedented at the time. And so, again, we can read in Nixon's memoirs that when he became aware of these demonstrations, he became aware that he really couldn't follow through on the threat. Just to appreciate, that was an extremely dangerous time that few people knew about then or now. So Nixon basically created a secret nuclear alert that went on for 29 days. They were flying nuclear weapons up along the Russian coast. They were deploying. They put B-52s, nuclear-armed B-52s, wing to wing, in the Air Force bases in Nebraska, so they could be seen by the Russian satellites, so that they would understand the seriousness of it. And they even deployed nuclear weapons in commercial airports. And another force that led Nixon to kind of back off was the military concluded that it was just too dangerous, that they had to end the alert. So we have that. We have numerous threats during the Cold War. Well, he had other threats. Dien Bien Phu earlier in '54. Nixon and Eisenhower offered France 2 nuclear weapons to break the siege of Dien Bien Phu, but the French leaders were wise enough to know that the wind might blow the wrong way, and that was not an option they should pursue. Johnson made a threat in '67. And Dan Ellsberg argued, and I haven't seen hard documentation of this, but he argued that in the negotiations leading the Paris peace talks, leading to the end of the war, Nixon had made a secret commitment to Thieu in South Vietnam that if the North looked to and the South Vietnamese revolutionaries threatened to overrun the South Korean government, he would use nuclear weapons. And Dan argued that ultimately it was Watergate that prevented him from fulfilling that threat. Middle East, again, many threats. '56, the Russians actually, when Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal, the Russians made a threat that they probably could not have fulfilled. And then Eisenhower responded with a nuclear threat of his own. 1958, you have the crises in the Middle East, Beirut and Iraq, and the United States deploys nuclear weapons just off the coast of Lebanon. and actually Eisenhower's representative there threatens some of the Lebanese leaders who were not acting as we wanted them to that he had nuclear weapons just offshore and was willing to use them. The 67 war, the U.S. goes on a nuclear alert, 73. 1980, and we've got the Carter Doctrine. Basically, we'll use any means necessary when a nuclear armed state says any means necessary. That includes nuclear weapons, and that was reaffirmed by Reagan. And then we have, and one of the tragedies, I think, is that with the end of the Cold War, the negotiation of the INF Treaty, which was a great achievement, our anti-nuclear forces were tired, and people stopped paying attention. There were reductions in the size of the nuclear arsenals, but not their ability. No decrease in their ability to inflict nuclear winter. So nuclear weapons have been used repeatedly by the United States during the post-Cold War period. I actually went to school with Bill Clinton, undergraduate, so followed his career quite closely, and watched as he almost stumbled into a nuclear war with North Korea in 1994. Jimmy Carter had the wisdom to intervene, even if he wasn't entirely wanted, and came off with an agreed framework to block that. We had in both the Iraq wars, the U.S. prepared and threatened to use nuclear weapons. The fear was that as the U.S. was building up its forces to attack initially in Kuwait and then later in Iraq, the thought was that the gathering forces would be vulnerable to a chemical attack from Saddam Hussein. And so the plan was and the threat was made to use nuclear weapons if Saddam attacked U.S. forces with chemical weapons. And interestingly, in Foreign Affairs Journal, kind of the doctrine of the liberal imperial world here in the United States, after the war, Howard Baker and others were very clear that they had used the nuclear threat, and then Prime Minister Major jumped in, making his own threat to reinforce that of the United States. So it puts Britain on the list. We had Clinton's threats in relationship to Libya and elsewhere in Africa. So that's sort of a summary of that history. 9/11, there was also an initial nuclear alert. What do I want to say here? And just to say that the reality is that the United States, as I document in the book, has made these threats and preparations at least 30 times over history. The Russians, fewer, but Medvedev loves making these threats, apparently. But the reality is also that other nuclear powers have also made these threats. India and Pakistan during their wars. In 1973, during the Middle East War, again, as Kissinger is trying to what I want to say, to exploit the war toward U.S. outcome, the desired outcome. Initially, the U.S. withheld sending spare parts and weapons to Israel. Golda Meir was quite upset, and in order to force the release of those weapons, she threatened to use the temple weapons. Which is to say Israel's nuclear weapons, probably against Syria, but to precipitate a crisis from Russia. North Korea has made threats, and Britain and France. I mean, France in relationship to quote unquote terrorists. So it's a nasty history out there. It's a very dangerous world that we live in, and the reality is that we face two existential threats: nuclear weapons and the climate crisis, I did an interview with Noam Chomsky a couple of years ago. It's on our webpage, and it's just absolutely brilliant. He says, we face these existential crises, and others as well. And we know what the solutions are. They're obvious. In the case of nuclear weapons, get rid of them. But the question is whether there's the will. And so, just to say that I've had the greatest respect for CND, Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, for its work, for its mobilization, for being the second nuclear disarmament social movement in the world. And I'm glad to be working with you now. And we pull together as we can, because the options aren't good, and we're in a very dangerous moment.
Thank you, Joseph. I'm going to switch back to general view. Well, if that wasn't a sobering survey of US nuclear threats over, well, since the opening of the atomic age, in succinct form, then I don't know what was. And obviously, there's a lot there for us to think about and to discuss. But at this point, I think it'd be good to first offer to open up the discussion to those of us who are here. If people have particular questions or comments directed towards Joseph, they'd be more than welcome. I've got a couple of questions lined up, or at least things I'd like Joseph to expand upon a bit more, I think, rather than questions. But I'll give others the opportunity to put a question or to make a comment first off. And if not, I'll abuse my position as chair of the meeting. Okay, well, I'll throw my first prompt at you, really. So the history you go through and the history you've detailed over the past half an hour or so, and what is detailed in the book, raises one signal question to me, and it's an obvious one, really, which is, we are told over and over again, repeatedly, and with increasing vehemence, that the main purpose of possession of nuclear weapons is to function as the ultimate guarantor of security. So there's this deterrence theory, so-called. We're told that it is a deterrent, and that's its primary function. We also, lots of people are familiar with the concept of mutually assured destruction, which is supposed to be there to buttress this deterrence idea. But it seems to me that what the things that you've detailed and the instances in history where direct nuclear threats have been made by the United States and others completely contradicts those propositions of mutually assured destruction and deterrence. So I wondered if you could say a bit more about that, really, and where the reality of the history leaves those concepts.
So, I think we need to think with a little bit of complexity, which is often not what we are inclined to do. So, the main thrust, certainly for the United States, has been global dominance. But the Russians, the Soviets not wanting to be dominated, right? They moved quickly to develop their own atomic and hydrogen bombs as a deterrent. And so you have sort of a dual dynamic at play. Imperial ambitions, and because you have proliferation of nuclear weapons, a deterrent dimension, at least in theory. But we need to look at the deterrence theory a little bit more carefully, right? There's the assumption that it's fail-safe, that others will be deterred, and that accidents are not going to happen. I spent a fair bit of time in the book's chapter on the Cuban Missile Crisis to explain that even we tend to think that the president or maybe the prime minister has full control over his nuclear arsenal. But if we look at the Cuban Missile Crisis, what we see is that at the height of the crisis, one of the U.S. generals intervened secretly and escalated the level of nuclear alert in a way that the Soviets leadership could see, but others couldn't, rubbing their noses into the crisis and the fact that they had far fewer nuclear weapons than the United States. So the possibility there of an overreaction by the Soviets was quite real. But two others. At the height of the confrontation, when Kennedy had ordered U.S. Navy not to be depth charging Soviet submarines in the Caribbean because he wanted Khrushchev to have a little bit of quiet and not be distracted while he was considering a U.S. proposal for resolution of the crisis. But some of those folks in the Navy thought, there's no better opportunity to be practicing depth charging than now in the Caribbean. And so you had U.S. destroyers depth charging Soviet submarines. In one case, the depth charges were so shaking a given submarine that it was losing oxygen. That the Russian Soviet naval forces were beginning to pass out from lack of oxygen. And the question among the commanders of the Soviet submarine was whether or not they should launch their nuclear-armed torpedoes before they all went down. They're soldiers with fighting spirit. And the Soviet doctrine at the time was that all three of the commanding officers had to agree on the launch. Two of them wanted to do the launch. The third said no. And thus the Cuban Missile Crisis did not escalate into a nuclear war that would have ended us all. I mean, at the time, even in the Kennedy administration, the expectations were that the odds of nuclear war were between a third and a half. Yeah, so you've got that, and also in that Cuban Missile Crisis, Cuban Missile Crisis, you had a launch order that went to U.S. nuclear launch order that went to U.S. forces in Okinawa. It was an order, and fortunately, the commanding officer there thought, "Oh, this must be a mistake," and he didn't follow through. So we have this thing, as we face, I've been focused more on Asia Pacific in recent years, but we faced the situation where an incident, a miscalculation, an accident, an overamped sailor on a U.S. or a Chinese ship could launch torpedoes, could launch missiles at the other, and move into an escalatory dynamic that could lead to nuclear confrontation between the United States and China. So the idea that deterrence is fail-safe is just absolutely a myth. And of course, we have it any number of times when you've had the wrong cassette during a training put in, and the orders have gone through. There's the Russian was a Colonel Peskov who had the courage to refuse to send a we're under attack order when his computer systems were saying that the Soviets were under attack. So and the reality is that humanity hangs in the balance here. It is truly madness, and to say that it's deeply institutionalized, right? In our governments and our societies, and that makes it all the more dangerous. I know you had some questions about evil, Tom. My frame of reference remains. I'm Jewish. Remains what Germans and others did and didn't do during the Nazi period, and the idea that you just follow orders is madness. It takes courage. Most of us want to pay our mortgage, be with our kids, not be imprisoned or killed like Navalny. But in the end, we have to be clear about what's most important. And most important right now is getting rid of nuclear weapons and reversing the climate crisis.
Thanks, Joseph. I'll come back to my couple of questions on evil, perhaps if we have time, but there are a couple of questions in the chat, and I'll field two at you. One from Mike, who asks, you mentioned at one point the US deployed nuclear weapons in civilian airports. Can you please expand on that? And
Yeah.
okay, you do that one. We'll take them one at a time. Go on.
Only to say, I mean, I live in the Boston area. They had deployed nuclear weapons to Logan Airport, which is in the heart of Boston. What they plan to do with them, I can't tell you. But nuclear weapons are not normally based in civilian airports. I can't tell you a whole lot more than that, but that's what's on the record.
Thanks, Joseph. And the second question we've got here is from Eamon, and this is a question that's been preoccupying me over the past 18 months or more. So Eamon asks, whose decision is it to redeploy US nuclear weapons in the UK, given that the US calls the shots in that relationship? Is it part of an agreed NATO strategy?
Well, I can't answer the second part. I don't know what the discussions within NATO have been. What we do know is that the decision was taken in more than one place, right? I mean, ultimately, Biden has to sign off on it. But the origin of this will come from a combination of the diplomats in with their ties and jackets and military figures attached to both the embassy in London, but also to NATO in Brussels. It's a decision made by members of Congress who vote to implement it. It's a decision that comes out of the structure of the U.S. Political culture and the culture as a whole. I wish it were otherwise. We're watching it now, for example, with Gaza, right? I mean, the deep complicity, and let's add the word evil, in terms of the U.S. Support for Israel's genocidal attack in Gaza. One doesn't want to have to say that one's country is doing such evil, but it is, and it's hard for people to face it. I will say I was struck during the earlier Trump years at how quickly so much of the society, and certainly the Republican Party, fell in lockstep with Trump. And all I could think about was how people in Germany fell in lockstep behind Hitler. The United States is not Nazi Germany, but we have Nazi and fascist forces here for sure. And we also have, and I don't think I would call them the Nazi forces, but the institutional power of the military-industrial complex and people's willingness to live, make their money from, not question it, is a reflection of a kind of a deep societal evil.
Yeah, I've just got a follow-up on the Lakenheath question, which does relate to some of the dynamic that we're seeing play out in Europe over questions of nuclear weapons possession and the role that they play. We might say more about the potential fate of NATO with a second Trump presidency in a bit, but part of the narrative that is being played out, or at least, I mean, I'd call it the propaganda that's being offered up to us, is that the US's decision to station their nuclear weapons in the UK once again is a consequence of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But if you track back in the history in the history of all of this, the F-35s, the new F-35s, this new generation of nuclear capable jets was already deployed. The first squadron was already deployed to Lakenheath in the December before Putin's invasion. So these sorts of decisions take a long time to play out. but of course, it won't have escaped the notice of Russia that this new generation of nuclear capable jets had been stationed in the UK and were to be rolled out across Europe prior to his invasion. So,
Yeah.
just say a bit more about kind of the timeline of these sorts of decisions and how they might fit into kind of what we're seeing in Europe at the moment, in your view.
Well, a number of these, and I can't claim to be expert on this particular decision, but you're absolutely right that the decision was in place well before the Russian invasion. Look, it takes a long time to design, build, and test a bomber, a missile. Often it's a decade or more. So you also have I mean, the reality is that the Pentagon and that portion of the Department of Energy that's responsible in part for our nuclear weapons. I mean, they've got more money than God. So they can begin a process looking at possible options, and then over time, a number of the options harden. The other part is you have just a number of decisions that are made not for strategic purposes, but for financial purposes. And you've got members of Congress who are dependent on bringing the jobs to their district. So you're looking at a process, Tom, that was probably much longer than a decade. And I think we have to appreciate it. It's even worse now with AI and the levels of misinformation coming from cyber sources, as well as others. Uh, there's like no scruples in terms of manipulation of uh, of news and propaganda, right? It's I mean, our societies have been and are now much more threatened in terms of possible democracy by these forces. Um, it may not be as articulate as you'd hope, but this is what you get.
No, that's good enough for me. I've got more questions and points, unless I can talk on and on and on, or ask as many questions as I want. But if others want to throw something in, here's your opportunity before I start again. Okay, I'm going to ask about empire, I guess, and this phrase used, the taboo on empire, which I find, a fascinating aspect of US history, really, given, everything, everything that I've witnessed in my lifetime, and in terms of, when I first came into politics, or political activism, it was clear to me that, we were dealing with an empire, an imperial state. So I just want to ask really about how, some of the dynamics of how America's or American activists' self-conception that they were actually dealing with an imperial power, with an empire, kind of came about. And one of my questions, well, it comes in two parts, really. I mean, the degree to which the civil rights movement, may, linked to that growth of understanding and growth of appreciation, when people were trying to understand what exactly is this America that we're dealing with, what's its dynamic, what's it all about, to what degree did that movement feed into kind of the understanding of the peace movement about what was being dealt with here. And my other question relates to Hannah Arendt, who I know from the discussion we had last time we met, last time we sat down, which was in an Italian restaurant in Manhattan. You talked about your appreciation for Arendt. My second favorite philosopher after Russell is Arendt's first husband, Gunther Anders, who wrote at length about both the Holocaust, the opening of nuclear age, and everything that meant. But I'm aware that, in Arendt's work on totalitarianism, she linked the growth of totalitarian regimes and the totalitarian state with the development of imperialism and empire. So kind of two sides of a question around the American empire, really. To what degree did the civil rights movement play into developing an understanding? And what does Arendt have to tell us about the American empire itself? And also, what did she write about the nuclear age? Because I'm aware she did write some stuff on
that. Excuse me. Um, you know, back in the mid '80s, when I was beginning to go deeply into understanding the relationship between U.S. nuclear war policies and its foreign military intervention, I was involved in making a film, and we interviewed quite a number of people. I think you can probably find it online. I never liked the title. I didn't have financial control over the title, which was The Last Empire. I don't think the American Empire is the last empire. But in the beginning, we used a lot of archival footage, especially Noam Chomsky and Howard Zinn, who went through a series of statements by U.S. presidents about how we are really, we're the good people. We would never intervene to undermine other countries or to sabotage the peace. And we had archival footage of every president from I think Truman through through Reagan. Very powerful. But it also had it against archival footage of U.S. forces fighting in the Philippines, 1898 to 1903, Vietnam, I mean, you name it. We Grenada. So we're in this situation where I think Noam described the control of thinking in this country as being very, very subtle, very, very advanced, and very complicated. So, maybe I don't know what the situation is in Britain in terms of socialization of young people, but in our schools, kids are taught that we're a country for freedom, the home of the brave, and all that nonsense every day, and so people are amenable to that. In the state of Florida now, you can't teach in the schools about slavery, and increasingly, there's a whole lot of U.S. history you can't talk about in Florida. Not that people did it anyhow. Um, I think, certainly in looking to the 50s, 60s, 50s and 60s, the height of the civil rights movement, some of the leaders understood. I mean, Malcolm X, for example, got it and tried to teach. But mostly it was focused on the need to end the American apartheid laws, and foreign policy didn't figure too much into that. I mean, King late, right? King's 1967 speech at Riverside Church, where he does use the term empire, and he's looking at the fundamental evil of it. But that was still at sort of, if you will, an elite level within the movement. And our social movements here, the peace and justice movements, have been an interesting mixture of, on the one hand, sectarian leftists have played a significant role over time, and maybe played a leading role in the civil rights struggle in the 30s and 40s, and were certainly present in the 50s and 60s. And then you have liberals, and one of the unhappy dynamics here in the United States is that when we have a Democratic president, our peace movement tends to go pretty silent, because they've invested their hopes in electing a Democrat, and they don't want to undermine him. So we have that complexity. Um, the understanding of empire has been present in some sectors of academia, more so now. I mean, I think it's interesting. In '81, I interviewed Yasser Arafat. Not terribly impressive, but one of the things he said was it's cowboys and Indians all over again. The kind of racial dimensions of the settler colonialism. And I think what we've seen maybe in the last 15 years or so is particularly in the African American and to a lesser extent maybe Latino and Asian communities, a deepening understanding of that and thus of empire. But it's certainly not even now it's not widespread. And there was greater attention to it during the Trump era. One Sunday morning, we could look at the front page of the New York Times, and there was a quotation on the cover, a quotation not attributed to Karl Rove, but apparently it was Karl Rove, saying, "We're an empire now. We can do what we want. And you in the media, you can report about it, but then we'll have moved on to something else." In the early Trump era, there was more discussion and even on the right, a celebration of empire. But that's faded. Um, and now we're fighting the evil empire and Putin's evil empire. So we have that. It's been a while since I've read Hannah Arendt, but uh, what occurs to me actually is in an earlier period when there was a significant Israeli peace movement. They had a slogan, and I'm going to mess it up because I don't remember exactly what it said, but I remember its meaning, which was that which is done outside the imperial walls finds its way inside the imperial walls. And so, you see, uh, I think early on in the book, I'm talking about what it took to mobilize for the war against Germany, right? And the creation of a militarist society in the First and Second World War here, and that's institutionalized. It's grown, and again, I mean, those structures are fundamentally evil. Um,
Thanks, Joseph. There are no, oh, Frank.
Yeah. Hello. Hello,
Hello.
Joseph.
Hello.
I don't know whether you remember me, but we did meet at the TPNW conference.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The UNESCO Constitution, the preamble to the UNESCO Constitution says that uh, since wars begin in the minds of men, it's in the minds of men that we must create the weapons, or I forget the exact final words. I always add to that, it's the minds of some men. And what I'd like to ask, following on from some of what you've been saying, is how can people who are not evil monsters, but people like Biden and Reagan and all the other presidents and equivalents in other places, to actually contemplate the possibility of an action of theirs causing literally millions of deaths. Can you say anything about the mindset of the leaders who can contemplate those things?
Well, part of me thinks back to Shakespeare and fundamental tragedy and the combination of where some compromises lead, what they grow out of, and the kind of tragedies that follow. Um, I'll make reference to Bill Clinton, um, former president. Um, I was his classmate. There were 250 of us in our class. And so over the course of 4 years, we got to know one another pretty well. He came from an upper middle class family in Arkansas, not out of the political elite. And from the first day that we were there, he wanted to become president. It was obvious to all of us. And what you watch with Bill was how he bent himself to power to rise with it. And all along the way, making the compromises because that's what he needs to hold on to power, hold on to status, make some money. I worked when I was in college in Washington. I worked in Congress for a little while in the House of Representatives. And what you saw was that the kind of pathetic fear, not of all the members of Congress, but of many of them, that their position in Congress gave them a particular status, ego satisfaction, and they were desperate not to lose it. So, in that circumstance, they're loath to vote against the military budget. They're loath to step out and call for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, or to press Biden, to in turn press Zelensky toward working for a ceasefire and a compromise solution to that war that would lead to Ukrainian neutrality. Sometimes it's a decision of, well, if I don't do this, something worse will happen. But it's a slippery slope, and the role of people who hold to a very clear sense of integrity, a very clear sense of truth, is fundamentally important, and we don't have enough of them, certainly in our society right now.
Yeah, and what is true of the United States is very much true in the United Kingdom. Milan.
Thank you for calling on me. Joseph, I've been trying to think of how someone who's never encountered what you've put forward, a British, or sort of like a reasonable-minded British person who's never heard all this stuff before, how they might react, and who's just being exposed to kind of mainstream history. And I'm imagining one thing they might say is, okay, I'm not sure about what you've said, or all the things that you've said, but okay, let's say that all the things that you've said did happen the way that you say they happened, but they sound like a long ago thing, like a ancient history. That doesn't sound, from what you've said so far, like that's really about what the US government is about now. So why should we be concerned about that in relation to the present and future US governments, given that those events happened so long ago?
Okay. Yeah, I guess I'm old enough that I don't think of some of those events as being so long ago. But just to say, the United States is now spending probably a minimum of $1.7 trillion to modernize its entire, basically replace its entire nuclear arsenal and all of its delivery systems. It's not doing that just for job creation. We're in a situation where we have this 2 aircraft carriers off the coast of Gaza, right? If the Arab Street goes pretty wild, if Israel moves perhaps even to bomb Iran's nuclear infrastructure, who do you think is going to be behind and backing up Israel? It's going to be our nuclear arsenal, and maybe also our AI capabilities as well. And just to appreciate that in this new era, AI can function with absolutely devastating national consequences. I mean, huge. Take out water systems, take out food supplies. I mean, the whole 9 yards. So we have that. We have that the United States doctrine is still first strike use, as is Russia's. And we've had Medvedev's threats. I mean, I think that the danger of use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine has decreased early on. It has some parallels to Cuban Missile Crisis. But we still face a situation where we could have either horizontal escalation, which is to say it could break out of the Ukrainian Russian geographic sphere. If you touch into NATO, it could get more than a little bit interesting. And similarly, if somebody gets trigger happy on the Russian side, say with the tactical nuclear weapons, the likelihood of a U.S. nuclear response and all of us moving up the escalatory ladder is very real. So you know we're one of the things that's also interesting is all the way back to Robert McNamara said, you know, we're alive now, not so much as a question of policy, but as a function of luck, because there's been that many nuclear weapons accidents, that many miscalculations. So, you know, maybe the chance that we'll eliminate humanity via a nuclear threat is like 1/2 of 1%, 1 out of 200. Are those the odds you want your families, your loved ones, the future to rely on? I mean, accidents happen.
Thanks, Joseph. And it's 1 out of 200.
Just one thing to say, because one of the questions too is, well, how do we get people to engage, given how big this thing is, and where people might have some meaningful input. And so just to say that we do have a campaign here in the United States initiated by Physicians for Social Responsibility, termed Back from the Brink. And it's working to get resolutions passed in city councils. I was at a meeting last night for my own town council, trying to get institutions, labor unions, and so on. We have 42 members of Congress who have endorsed it so far, which basically calls for no more spending for the nuclear weapons modernization, for engaging in negotiations for the reduction of the nuclear weapons, taking nuclear weapons off of hair trigger order, a number of steps, and maybe approaching people at this concrete level is a way to at least begin the conversation.
Thanks, Joseph. I mean, the thing, it's 1 in 200, the risk, but that's every day. Yeah, I think it was Ellsberg who made the point. Yeah, you keep rolling the dice every single day in this fashion, and eventually you get unlucky. So I think I've got one more point or one more question I want to put to you, which is potentially a whole other hour and a half long Zoom meeting. So don't feel you have to go on about this. But one of the things that is concentrating the mind in the US and certainly in the UK is the prospect of another Trump presidency. You know, it wasn't that long ago that we were dealing with the fallout from Trump's various actions, not least the sabotage of the INF Treaty and the JCPOA or Iran deal, and much else in the nuclear field and not. What is the state of play? What might we expect? What are the risks?
So are you throwing the dice over there? You know,
it seems loaded.
it's absolutely a crap shot. You know, we're caught between, on the one hand, a candidate and actually a movement, you know, which is racist, fascist. In Trump's case, imagine electing a convicted rapist for president. You know, corruption runs so deep, disregard for human rights here, or human rights anywhere, respect for people in other countries, let alone this one. You know, a second Trump presidency would be absolutely catastrophic. We might not have another election after that election. And if we go to worst case scenarios, you know, we have a number of armed militias now. We have a Supreme Court which is stacked, not even close to being a fair Supreme Court. So that we face the possibility of a seizure of power here, either through election or through, you know, a functional coup. So that's what we have on the one side. On the other, we have a president who has saved the economy and who has done what he can in terms of human rights here within the United States and on the climate, but who, it's a war president, a war party of the Democratic Party, and a situation in which I was talking to somebody yesterday, was talking about the U.S. veto of the ceasefire at the UN the other day, and how that undermines any possible leverage for the U.S. diplomatically in relationship to Ukraine and trying to bring that to a negotiated settlement. So we are caught in an absolutely horrible place. I find myself thinking, and I live in Massachusetts, so I could vote for Bridget Bardot's ghost and it wouldn't matter. The state will go Democratic. But the key is a number of swing states. We have this crazy electoral system here, where majority victory doesn't guarantee you election. I had a friend, an Iranian doctor, who was in Irvine prison in 78, 79, the time of the Iranian Revolution. He was a Marxist, and he described debates that they had within the prison over how they should relate to the revolutionary forces and to the continuing power of the Shah. And the question of whether it was better to vote for a imperial lackey or for a primitive form of leadership. And the sense was to go for the lackey now and to fight against him tomorrow. A number of people I talked to are talking about holding their nose and voting for Biden, but organizing the next day. I'm still struggling with it. Members of my board are struggling with it. And my deepest hope is that with Biden's numbers so low, grandees in the Democratic Party will intervene, tell Biden that he maybe has the third most impressive legislative victory history in the U.S. presidency after FDR and Lyndon Johnson. That's a legacy he should honor. The rest of us should honor. But that if he's committed to democracy, he should really step aside and let a younger, more dynamic, hopefully more progressive figure step into his place. So, that's a desperate hope. I know it's maybe the various stages of dealing with death and grief, bargaining to the end. But I remember in '68 when Johnson did step aside. It was a shocking event, and one hopes that lightning can strike twice.
Okay, thank you, Joseph. And on that positive note, we will we will leave it there. And I'm sure we will return to questions of what's happening in the US over the coming months. But thank you again, Joseph, for your presentation this evening. Do get yourself a copy of Joseph's book. It is well worth the read. And tune into the campaign for Peace, Democracy and Common Security's website, which has a huge amount of information on. And Joseph is a regular commentator on a variety of platforms. So it's worth continuing to Google his name for his latest thoughts and latest views on developing situations. So thanks very much, Joseph. And thank you to Milan and to Peace News for hosting us this evening.
Tom and Milan, it was my pleasure, and I look forward to our continuing collaborations. Be well.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Good night, all.
Thanks, Milan. See you soon. Bye.